Welcome to Sleep Workshop, and thank you for joining us tonight. Have you ever gazed at the stars and wondered how the very first civilizations in Iran set the stage for an empire that would echo through history? We'd love to know what fascinates you most about ancient cultures. If you're ready to drift into the past, please give this video a like and subscribe for more soothing deep dives. In the rugged highlands and fertile river valleys of what is now southwestern Iran, around 2,700 years before the Common Era, a civilization unlike any its neighbors had emerged, one that would leave an indelible mark on the tapestry of human history and ultimately form the bedrock upon which the later Persian empires would rise. Today, we turn our attention to the Elamites, a people whose ingenuity in agriculture, mastery of metallurgy, development of a unique writing system, and complex socio-political structures would resonate through the ages, even as their name faded from the annals of dominant powers. From the earliest archaeological layers at Susa, their greatest urban center, to the hilltop settlements of Anshan and Awan, the Elamites carved out a network of city-states connected by careful irrigation channels that harnessed the seasonal inundations of the Karkay and Des rivers, transforming otherwise arid plains into fields of barley, wheat, dates, and sesame. This agricultural surplus not only fed dense populations but fueled craft workshops, where artisans produced intricately carved ivory objects imported from Mesopotamian workshops and re-envisioned with Elamite motifs, fine painted ceramics bearing geometric patterns and stylized animal figures, and copper alloys that would influence weapon and tool making across Western Asia. Politically, Elam was never a monolithic kingdom from the outset, but rather a tapestry of regional dynasties that rose and fell, each asserting control over Susa's temples, palaces, and fortifications. Among these early rulers, figures such as Peli and his successor, Qutakinsuchanak, stand out for their ambitious building programs, including the erection of ziggurat dedicated to the sun god Inshushanak, a deity whose name would echo through later Persian religious traditions, and the codification of laws inscribed on clay cylinders, which regulated property rights, tax obligations, and the duties of temple personnel. During periods of relative independence, Elamite monarchs maintained a delicate balance of power with the great city-states of Sumer and Akkad to the west. Sometimes they pledged fealty to the Akkadian Empire, serving as vassals and supplying troops and tribute. At other times, they capitalized on Assyrian distractions to press their advantage, even capturing Babylon under the reign of Shetraknahut in the 12th century BCE, an episode immortalized in stele that chronicled the spoils taken back to the vaults of Susa. Yet, despite these military excursions, Elamite society was marked more by its cultural creativity than by conquest. Their scribes adapted the cuneiform script inherited from Mesopotamia but transformed it into an Elamite writing system that blended logographic signs for whole words with syllabic characters, thereby encoding not only administrative records, tax receipts, land grants, diplomatic correspondence, but also royal hymns and myths that invoked a pantheon, blending indigenous gods with those of their neighbors in a testament to ongoing intercultural exchange. Religious life in Elam centered on elaborate temple complexes where priests performed rituals involving animal sacrifices, the burning of incense, and the recitation of incantations designed to secure fertility for the fields, longevity for the king, and victory in war. Archaeological excavations at Susa have revealed altars inscribed with dedicatory texts, vessels painted with ritual scenes, and even wooden musical instruments traced through fragments, indicating that music and ceremony were integral to civic and spiritual identity. The social hierarchy of Elam was stratified yet interwoven. At the apex stood the king, often styled King of Susa and Anshan, who claimed descent from divine ancestors and was supported by a court of nobles, high priests, and military commanders. Below them, free citizens engaged in crafts, trade, and farming, while a certain class performed labor in the king's workshops and agricultural estates. Trade routes radiated outward, carrying Elamite goods to Mesopotamia in exchange for lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan, silver and tin from the Iranian plateau, and exotic timber from the Zagros foothills, which underscores the sophistication of Elam's economic networks and its role as a hub of Bronze Age commerce. Crucially, Elamite metalworkers made breakthrough advances in smelting techniques, experimenting with different furnace designs and alloy compositions, particularly of copper, tin, and arsenic, that yielded stronger, more durable weapons and tools, innovations that would later be adopted by neighboring states and contribute to the broader diffusion of ironworking in the first millennium BCE. Linguistically, Elamite inscriptions reveal at least three distinct phases: the Old Elamite of the early 2nd millennium BCE, characterized by short administrative texts; the Middle Elamite of the 14th to 11th centuries BCE, in which royal inscriptions and cylinder seals flourish; and a late Elamite phase that overlaps with the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, marked by bilingual inscriptions in Elamite and Akkadian, which attest to the intense diplomatic and cultural interplay with the mighty empires of Mesopotamia. Despite occasional subjugation by Assyrian kings such as Tiglath-Pileser III, who exacted tribute and installed vassal rulers, the Elamites demonstrated remarkable resilience, restoring their autonomy at times and integrating Assyrian administrative practices into their own governance. This syncretic approach is evident in the administrative archives unearthed at Susa, which include meticulously kept records of labor levies, harvest yields, and temple offerings that provide modern historians with an unparalleled window into the day-to-day workings of a Bronze Age state. Elamite art and iconography, preserved on glazed bricks, cylinder seals, and bronze plaques, depict mythic creatures, winged bulls, horned serpents, and composite beasts that symbolize cosmic forces and royal power. Motifs later echoed in Achaemenid reliefs at Persepolis, thus establishing a visual continuity that bridged centuries and empires. By the time iron began to supplant bronze in weaponry and tools, Elam had already weathered successive waves of upheaval, from the collapse of the old Assyrian trade network in Anatolia to the disruptions of the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE. Yet the civilization adapted, adopting iron smelting techniques, restructuring its military contingents around iron-tipped spears and swords, and shifting its economic focus toward pastoralism in the Zagros highlands when riverine agriculture became less reliable. Ultimately, however, the twilight of Elam's political independence came with the rising tide of Median power in the 7th century BCE. As the Medes under Cyaxares forged alliances with Babylon against Assyria, Elam found itself squeezed between two ascendant neighbors, its cities besieged and its territories carved up. The decisive blow came in 646 BCE, when the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal sacked Susa and carried off its treasures, including the famous statue of the Elamite deity which now resides in the British Museum as a silent testament to Elam's former glory. Yet, while the political entity of Elam vanished from the map, the cultural and institutional legacies of this civilization endured. Achaemenid rulers would choose Susa as one of their imperial capitals, building palatial complexes that incorporated Elamite architectural techniques. The use of Elamite laborers, administrators, and military units in Achaemenid armies points to a continuity of personnel and expertise. And the very name Elam, transmitted through Hebrew, Greek, and Latin sources, would remind successive generations that long before the rise of Cyrus the Great, there existed a people who shaped the rivers, sculpted the lands, and wove a society whose innovations in writing, agriculture, religion, and statecraft underlie the story of Persia itself. As we drift back across the millennia, through the tombs and temples, the irrigation, canals, and forges of the Elamites, we recognize that their story is not merely a prelude, but a foundational chapter in the history of civilization, one that set the stage for the grandeur of Cyrus's empire, the policies of Darius, and the enduring legacy of a region whose past continues to captivate our imagination and lull us into wonder as we explore the origins of human ingenuity here at Sleep Workshop. Building upon the enduring legacies of the Elamite civilization and flourishing in the rugged highlands and fertile valleys of northwestern Iran around the early first millennium before the Common Era, the Medes emerged as a formidable power whose socio-political innovations, military strategies, and cultural syncretism would reshape the geopolitical map of the ancient Near East. By roughly 700 BCE, Median chieftains had coalesced into a loose confederation of tribal kingdoms under the leadership of royal houses such as the Arya and the Pasargadae, carving out dominions that extended from the Zagros Mountains through the plateau to the fringes of the Armenian highlands, thereby controlling critical trade arteries that linked Mesopotamia with the resource-rich fringes of Anatolia and the Caucasus. Economically, the Medes capitalized on their strategic position by fostering exchanges in precious metals, silver from the highland mines, iron ingots emerging from nascent smelting operations that built upon Elamite metallurgical techniques, and agricultural staples cultivated along river terraces irrigated by tributaries of the Tigris, enabling the gradual transition from a predominantly pastoral economy to one that supported burgeoning urban centers such as Ecbatana. The iconic Median capital, described by classical historians as a heptagonal fortress built on 7 concentric hills, each crowned by gleaming palaces and temples that reflected the Medes' synthesis of local traditions and Mesopotamian architectural influences. Politically, Median kings, like Darius, according to Herodotus, instituted groundbreaking administrative reforms by centralizing royal authority and establishing a permanent court with distinct offices for judiciary, chancellery, and royal guard, precursors to the satrapal system, later perfected by the Achaemenid Persians while codifying laws that delineated the rights of freemen, the obligations of tributary states, and the protocols for intertribal marriage alliances designed to bind noble families into a cohesive aristocracy. The religious landscape of Media was equally dynamic, with indigenous worship of sky deities such as Ahura Mazda and Mithra blending with the pantheons of their Median neighbors to create a rich tapestry of ritual practice. Priests officiated elaborate ceremonies atop sacred mountains, offering libations of milk and honey, and interpreting omens from the flight of birds and the entrails of sacrificial animals, thereby reinforcing the divine mandate of kingship and embedding religious observance deep within the socio-cultural fabric of Median society. Militarily, the Medes harnessed their intimate knowledge of mountainous terrain to excel in both guerrilla tactics and pitched battles, organizing cavalry units equipped with composite bows and short spears, innovations drawing upon steppe warfare traditions, while infantry levies, armed with iron-tipped javelins, secured mountain passes against incursions. Their martial prowess was on full display during the decisive campaigns against the Neo-Assyrian Empire, forging an alliance in the late 7th century BCE with the rising Babylonian power under Nabopolassar. The Medes besieged and captured the Assyrian capitals of Nineveh and Arapha in successive assaults that culminated in the fall of the once invincible Assyrian heartland, an episode that reshaped the balance of power and heralded the ascendancy of the Median Empire as the first Iranian state to triumph over Mesopotamian superpowers. Cultural exchanges flourished in the wake of these victories, as Median aristocrats adopted cuneiform literacy and commissioned inscriptions and administrative archives in Akkadian, while Mesopotamian scribes learned Median dialects to facilitate governance over newly acquired provinces, resulting in bilingual documents that testify to a vibrant intellectual milieu. Artistic patronage under Median rulers funded the production of glazed bricks, relief sculptures depicting mythical creatures, griffins, winged bulls, and hybrid deities, and intricately carved ivories that adorned palace walls, all reflecting an aesthetic that synthesized Anatolian, Assyrian, and Elamite motifs into a distinctive Median style. Women of the Median royal houses wielded significant influence as regents, diplomats, and economic patrons, sponsoring temple endowments and overseeing textile workshops that produced richly dyed linens and woolens, traded as far afield as Lydia and Egypt, thus embedding Media within the wider currents of Bronze and early Iron Age commerce. Meanwhile, the Median tribal confederation maintained a decentralized structure that allowed local chieftains to administer their territories according to customary laws, provided they rendered tribute and military service to the crowner system that balanced royal authority and regional autonomy and foreshadowed the satrapal organization of the later Persian Empire. In the realm of technology and infrastructure, the Medes undertook ambitious irrigation projects, carving canals from mountain streams to nourish orchards of pomegranates, olives, and figs, and constructing fortified granaries to safeguard surplus harvests against drought and invasion, thereby ensuring food security and economic stability across diverse ecological zones. As the mid-6th century BCE dawned, the Median Empire reached its apogee under rulers such as Cyaxares the Great, whose reign saw a consolidation of territories from the Zagros foothills to the plains of Mesopotamia, and whose patronage of religious institutions elevated the status of the Zoroastrian priesthood, setting the stage for the religious transformations that would later flourish under Achaemenid patronage. Yet the centralized monarchy that Darius had envisioned ultimately proved vulnerable to internal strife and dynastic rivalries, particularly in the wake of Cyaxares' death, when succession tensions and competing noble factions created openings for ambitious Persian princes to assert their authority. It was during this period of Median decline that Cyrus of the Achaemenid line, leveraging both marital alliances with Median nobility and the disaffection of subject peoples, a series of deftly orchestrated campaigns, first seizing control of Pasargadae and then moving against the Median capital. By around 550 BCE, the Median Empire was subsumed into the burgeoning Achaemenid state. Its elite folded into the Persian aristocracy, and its administrative and military systems absorbed wholesale, yet not without preserving key aspects of Median governance, religion, and culture that would resonate throughout the Persian imperial age. Thus, the rise and fall of the Medes stand as a pivotal chapter in the longue durée of Iranian history, a period in which tribal confederation matured into imperial administration, in which mountain tribes transformed into state builders who not only conquered the great powers of Mesopotamia, but also laid the institutional, cultural, and religious foundations that the Achaemenid Persians would inherit and refine, ensuring that the echoes of Median achievements would continue to shape the trajectories of empires for centuries to come. Under the visionary leadership of Cyrus the Great, the Achaemenid Empire emerged from a modest Persian principality centered at Pasargadae to become an imperial superpower whose domain stretched from the fertile plains of the Indus in the east to the deserts of Egypt in the southwest, and from the steppes of Central Asia in the north to the Aegean Sea in the west. This remarkable expansion, achieved between 550 and 330 BCE, was not solely the result of military conquest, but was equally the outcome of far-reaching administrative innovation, infrastructural mastery, economic integration, and an unprecedented policy of cultural and religious tolerance that bound a vast mosaic of peoples into a coherent imperial entity. When Cyrus overthrew the Median monarchs around 550 BCE, he did so with diplomatic skill as well as martial prowess, forging alliances with native elites and presenting himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror, strategy immortalized by the Cyrus cylinder, which proclaims his respect for local customs and religions and celebrates his decree permitting the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple. This early act of clemency set a tone for subsequent rulers, who would govern through a principle of fraternity under the rule of the great king, respecting the unique traditions of each satrapy while maintaining overarching cohesion through a network of royal appointees and professional inspectors known as the king's eyes and ears. Cyrus's son Cambyses too consolidated Persian rule in the west by defeating Pharaoh Psamtik III at Pelusium in 525 BCE and annexing Egypt, thereby extending Persian influence over the Nile Delta and incorporating Egyptian grain into the empire's logistical base. Yet it was under Darius I, who ascended the throne after a brief succession crisis in 522 BCE, that the empire achieved its definitive organizational structure. Darius divided the empire into approximately 20 satrapies, or provinces, each governed by a satrap responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining security, and administering justice. To curb abuses of authority, he deployed the king's eyes and ears trusted courtiers who traveled incognito to audit satrapal conduct and report directly to the monarch. Economically, Darius revolutionized the empire by introducing standardized gold coins, known as darics, and silver siglots, which provided a reliable medium of exchange that facilitated trade across diverse regions. Lydia's textile workshops, Babylon's grain stores, Phoenician glass factories, Egyptian papyrus industries, and Indian spice caravans were all interlinked by a common currency that encouraged the fluid movement of goods. Complementing this monetary innovation was the construction of the Royal Road, an over 1,600-mile artery of paved highways and relay stations, stretching from Susa in the empire's eastern core to Sardis on the western frontier. This network reduced message transmission times from months to weeks, enabled rapid military deployments, and fostered vibrant commercial exchanges that knit the empire together. Persian engineers also perfected Qanot irrigation systems, sinterground, tunnels that channeled groundwater from aquifers to surface fields, transforming arid lands into fertile oases that supported booming urban populations and generated agricultural surpluses to finance monumental building programs. The architectural legacy of the Achaemenids is epitomized by the palatial complexes at Persepolis, Susa, and Persepolis. Darius and his successors constructed the Grand Apadana Audience Hall, supported by columns carved from single cedar trunks and crowned with double-headed bull capitals, its grand stairways adorned with bas-reliefs depicting processions of delegations from every satrapy presenting tribute ivory from India, gold vessels from Nubia, spices from Arabia, and richly dyed textiles from Lydia, symbolizing the unity and ethos that underpinned imperial ideology. These reliefs did more than decorate. They communicated a message of centralized authority, illuminated by respect for local customs. Religious policy was similarly multifaceted. Although the Persian kings themselves personally adhered to Zoroastrian precepts and sponsored fire temples in Pasargadae and Ecbatana, they allowed Egyptian cults to thrive in Thebes and Memphis, Babylonian festivals to continue unimpeded, Anatolian shrines to function autonomously, and Phoenician port cities to maintain their own deities, thus minimizing potential sources of unrest and winning the loyalty of diverse communities. The Persian military combined a core of 10,000 elite immortals with auxiliary contingents drawn from each satrap, cavalry from Media, archers from Armenia, spearmen from Babylonia, and light infantry from the mountain tribes equipped with composite bows, iron-tipped spears, scale armor, and locally produced shields, creating a versatile force capable of operating across mountains, deserts, river plains, and coastal waters. Naval power was developed through shipyards in Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Egypt, enabling Persian fleets to traverse the eastern Mediterranean and supply campaigns in the Aegean. Yet the sheer scale and heterogeneity of the empire introduced structural challenges. The Ionian Revolt of 499 BCE, sparked by heavy taxation and local grievances, ignited a series of conflicts with the Greek city-states that culminated in battles at Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea between 490 and 479 BCE. Although Persian forces initially deployed their numerical superiority effectively, the Greeks' mastery of hoplite tactics, naval maneuverability, and the defensive advantages of narrow terrain ultimately thwarted Persian ambitions, revealing logistical vulnerabilities inherent in projecting power across distant regions. Internally, the administrative machine required constant maintenance. Royal inscriptions, trilingual proclamations in Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian underscored the empire's commitment to communication across linguistic divides. But local dialects and script traditions persisted in rural areas, necessitating bilingual or trilingual bureaucrats and at times causing delays in tax collection and legal adjudication. Moreover, these prolonged conflicts strained imperial coffers and underscored the difficulties of sustaining campaigns far from the heartland. Even as Persian diplomacy worked to forge alliances through marriage, tribute adjustments, and the occasional cooptation of rebellious city-states by granting them nominal autonomy in exchange for loyalty and tax payments, court life at Persepolis and Susa was one of opulent ritual, characterized by sumptuous banquets featuring date wine from Elam, dried fish from the Black Sea, scented oils from Arabia, and exotic fruits from Anatolia, accompanied by music performed on lyres, tamburs, and oboes. These ceremonies reinforced social hierarchies and bound the nobility to the great king through a shared culture of luxury and spectacle. Provincial taxation was calibrated to regional productivity, grain quotas in Mesopotamia, livestock and wool levies in the steppes, metal tributes from Anatolian mines, and textile exports from Lydian shoring, relative fiscal equity and smoothing economic fluctuations. Yet disparities persisted as satraps amassed fortunes that funded private palaces, irrigated pleasure gardens, and lavish patronage of religious institutions, thereby reinforcing social stratification. Amid these complexities, the empire's intellectual and artistic life thrived, Susa's archives preserved diplomatic correspondence between Persia and rival powers, economic records detailing land grants and labor levies, and copies of Babylonian astronomical texts alongside emerging Persian calendrical systems. Workshops employed artisans from Elam, Lydia, Babylonia, and Egypt to produce luxury goods, silver rhytons shaped like animal horns, gold jewelry set with carnelian and turquoise, ivory panels carved with mythic scenes, and lacquered boxes painted in crimson and black that circulated as gifts, reinforcing alliances among Persian satraps and foreign rulers. By the mid-4th century BCE, however, the cohesion of the empire began to unravel as satrapal families entrenched themselves, minting regional coins bearing local imagery alongside the king's portrait, fortifying frontier garrisons against nomadic raids, and intermittently negotiating separate agreements with external powers. Nevertheless, the Persian imperial framework satrapies, supervised by royal appointees, standardized revenues, imperial roads, professional court services, and way stations remained a resilient template. When Alexander of Macedon crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE with a tightly disciplined phalanx and companion cavalry, he confronted an empire whose armies, hastily levied and unevenly motivated, faltered under Macedonian tactical innovations. At the Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, key centers, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis fell with surprising speed as regional elites defected or submitted to Alexander's overtures of continuity and respect for local traditions. Although Alexander's partial burning of Persepolis symbolized the demise of Achaemenid political authority, he retained Persian satrapal structures, employed Persian courtiers, married into the royal family, and maintained Qanot networks and royal road relay stations, acknowledging the efficacy of Persian governance. After his death in 323 BCE, the Hellenistic successor states, the Seleucid Empire, the Parthians, and ultimately the Sasanians, drew heavily on Achaemenid precedents. The use of provincial administration under satraps or strategoi, the employment of Aramaic-derived bureaucratic practices, the maintenance of road and water infrastructures, and the imperial ideology of centralized rule balanced by local autonomy and religious pluralism. The material legacy of the Achaemenids endures in Qanot systems still vital to modern Iran and Central Asia, in road networks that shaped trade routes through antiquity, in architectural motifs revived by successive dynasties, and in a political ethos that champions respectful accommodation of diverse cultures within a unified state paradigm that resonates in contemporary discussions of federal governance and multicultural policy. Thus, as we reflect on the 2 centuries of Achaemenid rule, we see an empire that, despite its eventual fall, bequeathed an enduring blueprint for the organization of complex societies, influencing empires from Rome to the modern Middle East, and leaving an indelible mark on world history with its innovations in administration, infrastructure, economy, art, and ideology. In the turbulent aftermath of Alexander the Great's death in 323 BCE, his generals known as the Diadochevid for control of the sprawling territories he had conquered, and it was Seleucus I Nicator, one of Alexander's most trusted officers, who ultimately succeeded in carving out a realm that would come to be known as the Seleucid Empire. By seizing Babylon in 312 BCE, Seleucus established a dominion that at its height encompassed the Mediterranean coastlands of present-day Turkey and Syria, the rich alluvial plains of Mesopotamia, the historic lands of Persia, and reached eastward into the mountain fringes of the Hindu Kush. From the onset of his reign, Seleucus confronted the formidable challenge of administering this vast, culturally heterogeneous territory, which included Greek and Macedonian settlers, Aramean-speaking townsfolk, Persian bureaucrats, Jewish communities in Judea, Babylonian urban centers, and tribes of Bactria and Sogdia. To govern such diversity, he embarked on an ambitious policy of city founding and refounding, establishing or rechartering more than 50 palaces, including Antioch on the Orontes as his western capital and Seleucia on the Tigris as a counterpart. In Mesopotamia, designed to reflect Hellenistic ideals of civic organization with grid-planned streets, gymnasia, theaters, and stoas, while also incorporating local elites into civic councils and offering them honors and land grants. This policy served multiple purposes. It planted Greek cultural and military footholds throughout the empire, provided garrisons of veteran settlers to secure frontier regions, and created fiscal base towns whose citizens paid taxes into the royal treasury. Seleucus and his successors adopted dynastic titles reminiscent of the Achaemenid King of Kings, styling themselves as both heirs to Persian imperial legacy and patrons of the Greek cultural renaissance. At court, Greek became the lingua franca, while Aramaic remained the administrative dialect for much of the populace, and local languages such as Akkadian and Persian continued in religious and scholarly contexts. A trilingual mosaic that required Seleucid scribes to maintain archives and correspondence in multiple scripts, ensuring that imperial directives were understood from Antioch to Bactria. Economically, the Seleucids inherited the Achaemenid canal and road systems and invested heavily in refurbishing canals in Mesopotamia to guarantee grain shipments to the Levantine coastal markets and to Anatolian satrapies. They repaired and extended the famed Royal Road, built way stations and fortified posts at regular intervals, and utilized the Euphrates and Tigris rivers as logistical arteries, employing river fleets to transport bulky goods such as timber, stone, salted fish, and ceramics, thereby lowering transportation costs and stimulating interprovincial commerce. To facilitate currency exchange across their realm, they minted silver tetradrachms that bore the portrait of the ruling king on the obverse and Zeus seated on the reverse iconography that communicated both royal legitimacy and a pan-Hellenic religious identity, and issued bronze coinage for local markets. In agricultural policy, Seleucid administrators introduced Greek staples such as olive groves and vineyards in suitable Mediterranean and Mesopotamian climates, while also reorganizing landholding patterns in Hellenized regions by distributing former Achaemenid estates to Greek settlers, which generated tensions as displaced local landlords sometimes resisted these reallocations. The Seleucid military reflected this cultural synthesis. Phalanx infantry drilled in Macedonian formations, companion cavalry emulated Alexander's model, and war elephants imported via diplomatic ties with Indian rulers provided shock units on the battlefield. Local levies from Phoenician and Syrian peoples furnished archers, while riders from Media and Parthia contributed skilled horsemen accustomed to steppe warfare. Despite these combined arms capabilities, the Seleucid field armies were perennially overstretched as the empire's frontiers spanned deserts, mountain ranges, and distant river valleys. In the east, satrapal governors such as those in Bactria and Parthia cultivated semi-autonomous power bases, occasionally minting coins bearing only their own likenesses and titles, and exploiting central preoccupations in the west, particularly the dynastic conflicts against the rival Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt to assert independence. The protracted rivalry with the Ptolemies, known as the Syrian Wars, spanned 6 major conflicts between 274 and 168 BCE over control of Syria and Phoenicia. Each side deployed tens of thousands of infantry, cavalry, war elephants, and mercenary contingents in campaigns marked by oscillating fortunes. Seleucid kings such as Antiochus II and Seleucus II briefly captured key coastal cities and disrupted Ptolemaic trade, only to see Egyptian fleets and Greek mercenary phalanxes push them back. Treaties, often cemented by dynastic marriages, provided only temporary respite before hostilities flared anew, draining the imperial treasury, disrupting agricultural production in contested zones, and fostering discontent among civilians burdened by requisitions and garrison billeting. Meanwhile, internal court intrigues famously involving family rivalries, fratricide, and shifting alliances among the royal siblings further weakened central authority. Marriages between Seleucid princesses and local dynasts in Commagene, Cappadocia and Armenia sought to bind border regions to the crown, but also created rival power centers whose loyalties could waver when a new king ascended under murky circumstances. Religion under the Seleucids exhibited pragmatism, while Hellenistic cults of Zeus, Dionysus, and Apollo featured prominently in new temples at Antioch, Apamea, and Ai-Khanoum. Indigenous cults persisted with royal patronage. Mithraic shrines in Media, Marduk worship in Babylon, local Syrian deities in Emesa, and the Jewish temple complex in Jerusalem, each community negotiating its own terms of temple taxation, priestly appointments, and festival exemptions. The attempt by Antiochus for Epiphanes to Hellenize the Jewish populace by installing a gymnasium in Jerusalem and forbidding circumcision sparked the Maccabean Revolt of 167 BCE, an armed uprising led by the Hasmonean family that recaptured the temple, rededicated its altar, an event still commemorated in the festival of Hanukkah, and ousted Seleucid garrisons, establishing a semi-independent Jewish kingdom that persisted for a century. To the east, the rise of the Parthians under Arsaces I in the mid-3rd century BCE represented the erosion of Seleucid authority beyond Media. Parthian cavalry raids, intertribal confederations, and alliances with local satraps challenged Seleucid governors, culminating in decisive losses, most notably the defeat of Antiochus VII Sadites at the Battle of Ecbatana in 129 BC, after which Parthian control solidified over Babylonia and Media. Antiochus VII's brief reconquest and subsequent death in battle underscored the centrifugal forces tearing at the Seleucid realm, with the army decimated and loyal satraps unwilling to march far east again. Western satrapies like Syria and Cilicia assumed de facto autonomy, negotiating with Rome and Parthia as equals. Roman intervention accelerated the dissolution invited by local elites. Roman legions under Lucius Scipio Asiaticus, and later under Pompey, intervened in Seleucid succession disputes, and in 188 BCE imposed the Treaty of Apamea, which forced the Seleucids to pay an immense indemnity, relinquish territories north of the Taurus Mountains, and demolish their war elephants. These concessions crippled the Seleucid war chest, leaving the monarchy unable to maintain garrisons or pay mercenaries, while increasing provincial taxation fueled revolts among Greek settlers and indigenous subjects alike. By 64 BCE, when Pompey annexed what remained of Syria and incorporated it into the Roman Republic, the Seleucid Empire had been reduced to a patchwork of rump states governed by client kings until the last claimant, Antiochus the 13th Asiaticus, was deposed. Yet the Seleucid legacy endured. Its fusion of Greek and Near Eastern artistic motifs created a pan-Mediterranean aesthetic visible in city mosaics, portrait, sculpture, and coin iconography. Its network of Hellenistic palaeus became centers of trade, administration, and early Christian thought. Seeding the intellectual lineage that would carry Greek philosophy, science, and literature into the Islamic Golden Age. Its administrative experiments in provincial governance informed Roman and later Byzantine provincial models, and its promotion of Greek education, theatre, and civic institutions facilitated cultural syncretism that left an indelible mark on the architecture and urbanism of regions as diverse as Antioch, Palmyra, and Bactra. Moreover, the Seleucid emphasis on maintaining local autonomy within an overarching imperial framework prefigured later approaches to multinational empire, offering lessons on both the strengths and pitfalls of ruling diverse populations. Thus, as we reflect on nearly 2 centuries of Seleucid rule, we see an empire that, despite its eventual collapse under the weight of internal dissension, external invasion, and overextension, bequeathed a durable blueprint for cross-cultural governance, urban planning, economic integration, and artistic synthesis, an enduring testament to the dynamic interplay of Greek and Near Eastern worlds that reshaped the ancient Middle East and laid foundations for subsequent empires to follow. Emerging from the tumultuous aftermath of Seleucid decline in the mid-3rd century BCE, the Parthian Empire, also known as the Arsacid Empire, was founded by the chieftain Arsaces I, who led a confederation of eastern Iranian tribes against Seleucid garrisons in Parthia around 247 BCE. Over the next 4.5 centuries, the Arsacid dynasty would consolidate control over a vast territory stretching from the rugged Kopet Dag Mountains in the northeast to the fertile plains of Mesopotamia in the west, forging an imperial structure characterized by a delicate balance between central authority and regional autonomy, and establishing Parthia as a pivotal crossroads where East met West in commerce, culture, and conflict. In its early years, Parthia's rugged terrain, dotted with fortress towns and oasis settlements, provided natural defenses that allowed Arsaces I and his successors to repel Seleucid counterattacks and expand southward toward Media, Elam, and Babylonia. By the reign of Mithridates I, 171 to 132 BCE, Parthian armies had captured the major Mesopotamian cities of Hecatompylos, Ecbatana, and Seleucia on the Tigris, incorporating them into a loosely federated polity where local former Seleucid satraps retained significant autonomy in exchange for military service, tribute payments, and recognition of Arsas overlordship. This model of governance, a confederation of semi-independent kingdoms bound to the Arsacid monarch through personal allegiance and familial ties, allowed Parthia to marshal diverse resources, mounted archers from the steppe nomadic traditions of Hyrcania and Sogdia, heavy cataphract cavalry clad in scale armor drawn from the Iranian plateau, and infantry levies recruited from settled populations in Mesopotamia, Armenia, and eastern Anatolia, each playing specialized roles on the battlefield. Parthian military doctrine excelled in mobile warfare, employing horse archers to harass enemy formations at long range before delivering crushing charges of cataphracts, tactic that proved devastating against Roman legions unaccustomed to such fluid and layered tactics. Most famously at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, where the Parthian general Cyrus encircled and annihilated the forces of Marcus Licinius Crassus. Politically, the Arsacid kings wielded symbols inherited from earlier Iranian and Hellenistic traditions. They issued coinage depicting their crowned busts in frontal or three-quarter profile on silver drams and copper foals, while the reverse often featured the seated archer king or images of Heracles-like figures. blending Greek iconography with Iranian royal imagery. These coins circulated widely across Mesopotamia, the Iranian plateau, and into Central Asia, served both as a medium of economic exchange and as portable assertions of Arsacid supremacy. Administrative control was less centralized than under the Achaemenids or Seleucids. Rather than dividing the realm into satrapies, the Parthian monarch relied on a network of powerful, noble houses such as the Serenas, the Gaudas, and the Monobas, Zidzij, controlling hereditary fiefs, commanding their own military contingents, and governing major provinces. This decentralized structure fostered resilience, as local lords could mobilize quickly in defense of the realm, but also introduced chronic challenges to royal authority when rival houses jockeyed for influence or rebelled during periods of dynastic weakness. Economically, Parthia thrived on its pivotal location astride the Silk Road. Camel caravans bore Chinese silks, Indian spices, and Himalayan gemstones westward through Margiana and Hyrcania into Parthian hands, while Persian and Mesopotamian textiles, wine, and metalwork flowed eastward. Caravanserized roadside inns, spaced a day's journey apart, sprang up along these routes, supported by Parthian infrastructure investments in roads, bridges across the Euphrates and Tigris, and the maintenance of canal irrigation systems that sustained agriculture in otherwise arid regions. Urban centers, such as Ctesiphon, founded on the eastern bank of the Tigris, opposite Seleucia, evolved into cosmopolitan capitals where Greek, Aramaic, Parthian, and local dialects coexisted. Hellenistic theaters shared space with Zoroastrian fire temples, and bazaars hummed with merchants from every corner of the ancient world. Religious life under the Arsacids mirrored the empire's cultural syncretism. Zoroastrianism maintained its status as the preeminent faith of the court, with fire altars consecrated at royal palaces and nobles sponsoring rituals to Ahura Mazda to legitimize their rule. Yet Greek cults of Zeus and Heracles persisted in Hellenized cities. Local Semitic deities such as Marduk and Nabu continued to receive offerings in Babylonian temples, and remnants of indigenous Iranian folk religions, spirits, Kivarena, and ancestral hero cults persevered in rural districts, each community negotiating a delicate coexistence under Parthian religious tolerance. Artistic expressions under Parthian patronage likewise blended Greek, Iranian, and Mesopotamian motifs. Stucco reliefs in Palmyra depicting costumed Aramean nobles, rock-cut tomb facades in Hatra featuring Parthian-styled drapery folds, and the sculptural program of Nisa illustrating royal hunts and mythic narratives, all underscored the empire's role as a cultural melting pot. The Parthians also fostered intellectual exchange. The Academy of Gundishapur, established near the headwaters of the Karun River, became a center for medical learning, where Greek physicians studied alongside Persian healers. Translating Hippocratic and Galenic texts into Middle Persian, mathematics, astronomy, and astrology flourished as scholars from Hellenistic, Indian, and Babylonian traditions collaborated under the relative stability provided by Parthian patronage. Throughout its existence, Parthia engaged in intermittent warfare and diplomacy with its powerful neighbors to the west. Rome and Parthia engaged in a protracted struggle for control of Armenia, a buffer kingdom whose throne alternately housed Roman client kings and Arsacid appointees, leading to a series of conflicts in 66 BCE, 36 BCE, and again in 01 CE, each testing the strategic acumen of Parthian generals and the resolve of Roman emperors such as Augustus and Trajan. To the east, Parthian rulers navigated alliances and rivalries with nomadic Scythian and Saka tribes, occasionally recruiting them as mercenaries or allying through matrimony to secure the empire's fringes, while trade agreements with the Qajar Empire facilitated the continued flow of goods and ideas along the Oxus corridor. Yet, by the early 3rd century CE, the Parthian Confederation, straining under the weight of internal aristocratic rivalries, economic pressures from shifting trade routes, and the ambitious campaigns of Roman emperors like Septimius Severus began to unravel. The decisive blow came in 24 CE when Ardashir I, the founder of the Sasanian dynasty and ruler of Persis, defeated the last Arsacid king, Artabanus IV, at the Battle of Hormezgan, signaling the end of Parthian rule and the rise of a new, more centralized Iranian empire. Despite its collapse, the Parthian legacy endured. The art of heavy cavalry and horse archer tactics influenced Byzantine and later Islamic military systems. The network of caravan routes and urban institutions they nurtured continued to facilitate east-west exchanges for centuries. Parthian coinage standards informed Sasanian and even early Islamic mints, and the Arsacid model of balancing royal authority with noble autonomy offered lasting lessons in federal governance. Moreover, the cultural synthesis fostered by Parthian melding Hellenistic, Iranian, Semitic, and Central Asian elements shaped the religious, linguistic, and artistic landscapes of the Near East deep into the medieval period, laying the groundwork for the vibrant, interconnected civilizations that would emerge under the Sassanids and later under Islamic rule. As we reflect on nearly 5 centuries of Arsacid rule, we recognize a resilient empire whose decentralized structure, martial innovations, and cosmopolitan ethos allowed it to serve for centuries as a bulwark between East and West, a crucible of cultural fusion and a testament to the power of flexibility and adaptation in the governance of diverse lands and peoples. In the early 3rd century, a new dynasty arose in the heartlands of ancient Persia when Ardashir I, a prince of the Persis region, defeated the last Parthian king Artabanus IV at the Battle of Hormozgan in 224 CE and proclaimed himself King of Kings, inaugurating the Sasanian Empire realm that would endure for over 4 centuries and stand as one of the great powers of its age, rivaling Rome and later Byzantium while fostering a renaissance of Persian culture, Zoroastrian religion, artistic innovation, and imperial administration. From his capital at Ctesiphon on the Tigris River, Ardashir I reorganized the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia into a hierarchical structure of provinces governed by royal appointees and hereditary local dynasts, establishing fire temples as centers of worship and state administration, actively promoting Zoroastrianism as the state religion under the guidance of a reformed priesthood headed by the Wazir Amadar, or Grand Vizier, while still accommodating Christian, Jewish, Manichaean, and other communities under the imperial Egypt. His successors, notably Shapur I, expanded the empire's frontiers through campaigns that captured Roman Emperor Valerian at Edessa in 260 CE and secured territories in Armenia, Mesopotamia, and parts of the Arabian frontier, thereby creating buffer zones that allowed for economic stability and the consolidation of Sasanian authority. Under Shapur's patronage, the Sasanians commissioned the monumental rock reliefs at Firuzabad, Nakshi, Rustam, and Persepolis that depicted royal investiture scenes, triumphs over Rome, and investiture by the divine Ahura Mazda, blending Achaemenid legacy with contemporary political theology. The Sasanian administrative system was based on a strong central monarchy supported by a bureaucracy that collected land taxes, customs duties on trade caravans traversing the Silk Road, and tolls on river traffic, while the establishment of a professional standing army comprising cavalry of armored cataphracts, mounted archers, and auxilia from subject peoples ensured internal security and rapid response to external threats. Economically, the Sasanians leveraged their strategic position on east-west trade routes to foster urban prosperity. Ctesiphon, Gundashapa, and Hira became cosmopolitan centers where merchants traded silk from China, spices from India, furs from the Pontic steppe, and precious metals mined in Armenia and Central Asia. The crown's control of silver mines in the Zagros and copper quarries in Fars funded both the minting of high-quality drams inscribed with the profile of the reigning Shahanshah and the lavish patronage of public works. Agricultural transformation under Sasanian rule combined expansion of canot irrigation, reforestation projects in the Zagros foothills to stabilize soil, and the introduction of new crop varieties such as citrus fruits, sugarcane, and cotton. While royal estates produced wine, dates, and grains that sustained the populace, fueled urban growth, and underpinned the empire's fiscal health. The Sasanians also excelled in urban planning and architecture. Their palaces featured grand iwans with vaulted brick domes, intricate stucco decoration, and glazed tilework in royal reds and blues. The Tak Khosra at Ctesiphon, with its massive, single-arch facade, remains an enduring symbol of Sasanian engineering prowess. In the realm of art, the Sasanian aesthetic synthesized Hellenistic, Mesopotamian, and indigenous Iranian styles into luxurious metalworks such as silver plates depicting hunting scenes, gold filigree jewelry adorned with semi-precious stones, and rock crystal vessels that found their way into Byzantine and Chinese courts, as well as richly illustrated manuscripts and glazed ceramics that circulated throughout the empire. Religious life under the Sasanians witnessed the codification of Zoroastrian texts into the Avesta, under the revision of priests like Qajar, whose inscriptions proclaim his efforts to suppress heterodox sects and elevate orthodox ritual, leading to the construction of fire temples with permanent flame altars that became centers of community life. Despite these efforts at religious unification, the empire accommodated religious minorities through the designation of legal statuses such as dhimmi, protections for Christians and Jews, allowing them to practice their faiths in return for the payment of the jizya tax, thereby ensuring social cohesion in multi-ethnic cities. Militarily, the Sasanians engaged in protracted conflicts with Rome and later Byzantium in a series of wars punctuated by major battles. Ctesiphon, sacked by Valerian's forces in 260 CE, the stalemate campaigns of Julian in 363 CE, and the Persian campaigns of Khosrow that reached deep into Asia Minor, each war exacting heavy tolls on both empires but also stimulating diplomatic exchanges, prisoner exchanges, and the adoption of military technologies such as siegecraft and fortification design. Khosrow, also known as Anushirvan, presided over an intellectual and cultural golden age, founding the Academy of Gundashapa as a great center of learning where Greek, Indian, and Persian medical, astronomical, and philosophical texts were translated and studied. His reforms expanded the bureaucracy, standardized coinage further, and enacted legal codes such as the Mataganai Hazar Detistant that regulated marriage, inheritance, and land tenure, thus deepening the integration of law and governance. Under Khosrow's successors, the empire faced renewed challenges from nomadic Hephthalites in the east and internal power struggles among aristocratic families such as the House of Myron and the House of Keran, who wielded significant influence in provincial affairs, sometimes rebelliously. Nonetheless, Sasanian craftsmanship in silverwork, textiles, and glassmaking continued to flourish. and Sasanian motif-winged crowns, hunting scenes, and royal investiture iconography were adopted by neighboring cultures, influencing Byzantine, mosaic, and textile art. As the 7th century dawned, the Sasanians entered a period of internal crisis, exacerbated by a devastating outbreak of bubonic plague, economic strain from protracted wars, and the destabilizing revolt of Bahram Chobin. Amidst this turmoil, the nascent Islamic Arab tribes united under the banner of Islam and launched incursions into Sasanian territories, winning decisive victories at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah around 636 CE and the Battle of Nahavand in 642 CE, often termed the Victory of Victories, which shattered the Sasanian field armies, the fall of Ctesiphon to Arab forces, and the death of the last strong Shahanshah Yazdegerd III in 651 CE marked the formal end of the Sasanian Empire, but the legacy of its administrative innovations, architectural achievements, religious codifications, and cultural syntheses lived on. Persian became the lingua franca of successive Islamic caliphates. Qanat irrigation systems continued to sustain agriculture. Sasanian legal and bureaucratic models influenced Umayyad and Abbasid governance, and Sasanian artistic motifs, especially on metalwork and textiles, were incorporated into Islamic art. Even today, the narrative of the Sasanian Empire endures in the historical consciousness of Iran as a golden age of Persian sovereignty, Zoroastrian scholarship, and imperial grandeur. Its contributions forming a bridge between ancient Achaemenid traditions and the Islamic civilizations that succeeded it, thereby solidifying the Sasanians' place as one of history's most influential dynasties. In the wake of the Sasanian Empire's collapse in 651 CE, the Arabian tribes united under the banner of Islam rapidly forged an imperial system that would come to span from the Iberian Peninsula to the fringes of the Indian subcontinent over the course of two great dynasties, the Umayyads and the Abbasids, each of which contributed enduring legacies in governance, law, culture, science, and commerce. This period of nearly 6 centuries witnessed the transformation of a tribal confederation into a sophisticated theocratic state, the creation of an administrative framework that balanced centralized authority with provincial autonomy, the flourishing of trade routes that linked Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the emergence of a cosmopolitan society grounded in the Arabic language and Islamic faith, yet enriched by Hellenistic, Byzantine, South Asian, and North African influences under the Umayyads, who established their capital first at Damascus. Caliph Muawiyah, the first consolidated power through the militarization of the state, entrusting key provinces to his kin while retaining the Arab tribal nobility at the helm of military and administrative posts. This enabled swift campaigns that extended Umayyad rule across North Africa to the Atlantic coast, into Transoxiana beyond the Oxus River, into Sindh in the Indian subcontinent, and across the Pyrenees into Gaul, where the expansion was halted. At the Battle of Tours in 732, the Umayyad period saw the standardization of the Diwan system for tax collection, literally register, which organized stipends for soldiers, levied the jizya tax on non-Muslims, and collected zakat from Muslim subjects, thereby creating a reliable revenue base. Arabic replaced Greek and Persian in administrative correspondence, ensuring linguistic unity, while Umayyad governors wali, or amirovasor, local courts, maintained garrison towns and conducted land surveys to allocate kharaj, or land tax, according to the fertility of the soil and the productivity of irrigated fields. Architecturally, the Umayyads embarked on monumental projects that fused Byzantine and Sasanian styles with Islamic principles, erecting the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem in 691, an octagonal shrine crowned by a gilded dome and adorned with Quranic inscriptions that articulated the new faith's theological horizons, and the Great Mosque of Damascus, whose hypostyle halls and marble-clad courtyards became prototypes for subsequent mosque architecture across the Islamic world. The Umayyad coinage reform initiated the first purely Islamic currency, gold dinars and silver dirhams, inscribed with Quranic verses and devoid of figural imagery, thereby severing monetary ties with Byzantine and Sasanian precedents. However, by mid-8th century, growing discontent among non-Arab Muslims, Mawali, Persian bureaucrats accustomed to Abbasid court culture, and pious reformers critical of Umayyad dynastic rule culminated in the Abbasid Revolution of 750, which overthrew the Umayyad caliphs and ushered in a new era of Islamic governance centered initially at Kufa and then at Baghdad. Founded in 762 by Caliph al-Mansur on the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Abbasids, claiming descent from the Prophet's uncle Abbas, reoriented the caliphate toward a more inclusive vision that enfranchised non-Arab Muslims, integrated Persian administrative expertise into the Diwan system, and expanded the bureaucracy to include specialized departments for land revenue, postal services, the navy, the public works, and the Ministry of Justice, thereby professionalizing governance. Under the golden age of Harun al-Rashid and Al-Mun, Baghdad became an unparalleled intellectual center, where the House of Wisdom housed scholars who translated philosophical, scientific, and medical works from Greek, Syriac, Pahlavi, and Sanskrit into Arabic, while pioneering advances in algebra by Al-Khwarizmi, in optics by Ibn al-Haytham, in medicine by Al-Razi and Ibn Sina, and in astronomy by Al-Battani and Al-Farghani. The Abbasid caliphs patronized poetic circles in which the refined qasida form of Arabic verse celebrated themes of love, wine, and royal praise, even as the mystical inclinations of early Sufism took root in the private gatherings of ascetics seeking direct communion with the divine. Commercially, Baghdad's nexus position on the Silk Road propelled the trade of silk from China, spices from India, gold from West Africa via trans-Saharan routes, and furs and amber from the Baltic via Russian river corridors. Banking instruments, such as Sakali checks, emerged to facilitate letters of credit between merchant networks in Fustat, Siraf, Samarkand, and Constantinople, while caravanserais and riverine ports invested in by the caliphs sustained long-distance trade. The Abbasids also maintained standing armies composed of Turkic, Central Asian, and African contingents, often organized as Mamluk slave soldier regiments, whose loyalty was secured through land grants that bound military service to fiscal rights, thereby creating a precedent for the military patronage systems of later Islamic dynasties. Despite these achievements, the vast Abbasid realm faced centrifugal pressures. Local dynasties such as the Tulunids in Egypt, the Samanids in Transoxiana, the Muwahhid rulers in Ifriqiya, and the Alid Imams in the Hejaz carved out autonomous realms under nominal Abbasid suzerainty, while fiscal strains from maintaining the palace bureaucracy and lavish court expenditures under Al-Man's successors led to periodic revolts, most notably the fourth fitna of the late 9th century. Furthermore, sectarian rifts between Sunnis and Shi'i factions, between Mutazilites and traditionalists played out in court politics and theological debates, culminating in the Minna of Al-Man, an inquisition imposing doctrine on judges and scholars. which ultimately failed and undermined the caliph's moral authority. In the 10th and 11th centuries, regional warlords, the Boyards of Persia, the Hamdanids of Aleppo, and the Ghaznavids in the east exercised real power at the expense of the caliphs, who were reduced to ceremonial figures in Baghdad, while the Turkish Seljuk Turks in 1055 marched into Baghdad under Tughril Beg, assumed the title of Sultan, and restored Sunni orthodoxy under the Abbasid Caliph Al-Qim, inaugurating a dual system in which political military authority lay with the Sultan and religious ideological legitimacy with the Caliph. The Seljuk period witnessed a revival of Persian cultural influence in the court, epitomized by the Persianate vizier Nizam al-Mulk's establishment of Madrasista Nizamiya schools to train ulama in Sunni jurisprudence, while Persian literature flourished in works such as Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, which preserved pre-Islamic epic narratives in the Persian language, and Nizami Ganjavi's romantic Masnavis. However, between 1095 and 1291, the Latin Crusaders captured Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem, establishing principalities that challenged Muslim unity and diverted resources to protracted military campaigns. Meanwhile, in the east, the Ghaznavids and later the Ghurids launched new incursions into northern India, laying the groundwork for Delhi Sultanate rule. By the 13th century, the Mongol invasions under Hulagu Khan culminated in the siege and sack of Baghdad in 1258, which ended the Abbasid Caliphate's political existence, extinguished the last vestiges of its centralized bureaucracy, and resulted in the destruction of libraries, shrines, and the caliphal treasury, though an Abbasid line continued ceremonially in Cairo under Mamluk protection. The era of a unified caliphate based in Baghdad had given way to a mosaic of successor states. Nevertheless, the Umayyad and Abbasid periods bequeathed foundational contributions. Arabic became the lingua franca of science, philosophy, and administration across a territory stretching from Morocco to Central Asia. Islamic jurisprudence crystallized into the four major Sunni schools and key Shi'i doctrines. Monumental architectural style, hypostyle mosques, multi-domed shrines, ribbed vaults, and intricate muqarnis evolved into hallmarks of Islamic art, and the concept of a universal caliph, legitimized by religious as well as temporal authority, continued to shape Muslim political thought. Trade networks, judicial institutions, educational systems, and cultural norms originating in this era persisted under subsequent dynasties, from the Mamluks to the Ottomans, and influenced the development of modern states in the Middle East. As we reflect on these formative centuries, consider how the administrative innovations, artistic achievements, and intellectual ferment of the Umayyad and Abbasid Caliphates continue to resonate in contemporary discussions of governance, interfaith relations, and global trade. Let us know which aspect of this era captivates you most before we proceed to explore the rise of the Safavid Empire. Emerging from the rugged northwestern highlands of Iran at the dawn of the 16th century, the Safavid dynasty, founded by Shah Ismail I in 1501, transformed a fractious mosaic of Turkoman tribes, Persian principalities, and local potentates into a centralized Shia state whose territorial expanse, administrative sophistication, cultural patronage, and religious identity would define the contours of modern Iran and leave a lasting legacy on art, architecture, literature, and geopolitics. Shah Ismail's ascent to power was marked by a charismatic synthesis of Sufi mysticism and militant zeal. As a teenager, he proclaimed himself the divinely guided shadow of God on earth, rallied the Kizilbash tribe's fierce Turkic warriors, distinguished by their red headgear to his banner, and in swift campaigns, seized the ancient city of Tabriz, proclaiming Twelver-Shi'ism as the state faith and replacing the Sunni Abbasid Caliphates' spiritual authority with a new Persian model centered on the Safavid Shah. In the decades that followed, Ismail and his immediate successors consolidated Safavid control over Persian, Azerbaijan, Gilan, Mazandaran, and eventually the Mesopotamian alluvial plains, contesting with the Ottoman Empire to the west and the Uzbek Shabanids to the northeast in a series of pitched battles, most famously at Chaldiran in 1514, where early gunpowder firearms and artillery deployed by Sultan Selim I inflicted a rare defeat on the young Shah's cavalry, compelling a strategic recalibration that led the Safavids to invest heavily in Ottoman-style janissary and artillery corps while retaining the Kizilbash's loyalty through carefully negotiated Iqta land grants and tribal prerogatives under Shah Tahmasp, who reigned for 6 decades, from 1524 to 1576. The empire weathered internal Kizilbash revolts and external pressures by building a more centralized bureaucracy staffed by Persian administrators educated in the courtly chancery traditions of the Ilkhanid and Timurid predecessors, instituting a refined system of provincial governance divided into ostans and beglerbekliks, and sponsoring a flowering of Persian miniature painting, calligraphy, and manuscript production that fused Timurid ethereal elegance with a newfound sense of Shi'i devotional fervor. Visible in exquisitely illuminated works such as the Kamsa of Nizami and the Shonmeh of Shah Tahmasp himself, the accession of Shah Abbas I in 1588 marked the apogee of Safavid power and culture. Recognizing that the Kizilbash tribal confederation's decentralized structure threatened long-term stability, Abbas curtailed their influence by establishing a standing army of converted Georgian, Armenian, and Circassian Ghulam slave soldiers trained and paid directly by the crown, while reorganizing the Safavid cavalry into conventional regiments modeled on the Ottoman Sipahi and infantry armed with matchlock muskets and artillery pieces acquired from European merchants. This military transformation enabled Abbas to recover lost territories from the Ottomans in the Caucasus, secure Persian control over Hormuz Island after ousting the Portuguese in alliance with the English East India Company, and extend Safavid reach into Kandahar and beyond, thereby ensuring that Iran occupied a strategic crossroads between East and West, the Silk Road, termini, and maritime channels of the Indian Ocean. Concurrently, Abbas embarked on an unprecedented program of urban and architectural renewal that relocated the imperial capital from Kazvin to the newly founded city of Isfahan on the southern fringes of the Zagros foothills. There, he commissioned the construction of the vast Nakshi Jahan square framed by the grandiose Ali Kapu Palace, the imperial mosque with its soaring turquoise domes and intricate tile mosaics, and the regal arcaded bazaar that linked mercantile corridors to caravansaries, thereby creating a monumental urban ensemble that harmonized Safavid aesthetics of symmetry, color, and spiritual symbolism, and established Isfahan as one of the great capitals of world civilization. Economically, the Safavids fostered agricultural innovation by expanding Qanot irrigation to cultivate sugarcane and cotton in Khorasan, introducing new rice varieties in Gilan, and planting orchards of pomegranate, fig, and citrus in Fars, while state monopolies regulated the lucrative production and export of silk, carpets, and ceramics through royal factories that guaranteed high craftsmanship and distinctive Safavid motifs, curvilinear, arabesques, Boti paisley patterns, and human figures rendered in lively pigments that penetrated markets from Ottoman Istanbul to Mughal Delhi and fueled the empire's fiscal health. Trade networks flourished under Safavid auspices, with Persian merchants organized into powerful bazaar guilds trading silk, leather, metalwork, and rugs, with European companies operating in Bandar Abbas and Yemeni ports, while pilgrims traversed the expanded Hajj caravan routes through Herat and Mashhad, binding the empire to the wider Islamic world. Shi'i clerical institutions also gained prominence under Safavids. The emergence of seminaries in Qam and Mashhad produced leading jurists such as Sheikh Bahai and Muhakkik al-Hili, who developed the jurisprudential frameworks of Usuli Shi'ism, codified ritual practices of mourning and pilgrimages to shrine cities, and contributed to the ideological legitimization of the Imamate theology that underpinned Safavid statecraft. The office of the Sheikh al-Islam at court mediated disputes between religious elites and royal administrators, ensuring that the fusion of religion and monarchy remained balanced even during theological controversies over Sufi influences and heterodox movements such as the Harufi sect. Under Shah Abbas's successors, however, the empire faced mounting challenges. Factional rivalries resurfaced as powerful eunuchs and bureaucratic cliques vied for royal favor in Isfahan's ornate halls. Over-reliance on the Ghulam system undermined Kisilbash cohesion in frontier provinces, and protracted wars against Ottoman sultans such as Murad IV and Ottoman Grand Vizier Kprl Mehmed Pasha strained the treasury, depleted manpower, and left borderlands like Georgia and Armenia in flux, while the visionary Shah Abbas II (1642–1666) managed to stabilize internal governance and encourage cultural renaissance, most notably in the proliferation of ceramic factories in Kashi and the refinement of embroidered textiles in Kashanda. Subsequent reigns of weak or infant Shahs saw increasing decentralization. Local khans entrenched themselves as virtually independent rulers in Khorasan, Gilan, and Makram. Afghan tribal confederations raided the eastern provinces unchecked, and the once dominant Safavid naval forces dissipated, ceding maritime trade advantages to the Dutch and English, who established footholds in the Persian Gulf. The final blow came in 1722 when Muhammad Hotak, leader of the Ghilzai Pashtun tribes, captured Kandahar and then advanced on the imperial heartland, besieging and plundering Isfahan. After defeating the disorganized Safavid armies at Gonabad, the capture of Shah Sultan Husayn forced the capitulation of the capital, and a brief puppet regime failed to rally national resistance as successive Afghan and Ottoman interventions fractured the realm. In 1736, the Qajar commander and former Safavid loyalist Nader Shah Afshar expelled the Afghans, restored nominal Persian sovereignty, and deposed the last Safavid heir, crowning himself Shah and thus bringing an end to the Safavid dynasty's 4-century reign. Despite their collapse, the Safavids bequeathed an enduring legacy: the establishment of Twelver Shi'ism as the binding national creed of Iran, the creation of a distinctly Persianate bureaucracy that melded Turkish, Kurdish, and Persian elements, the patronage of art forms miniature painting, bookbinding, lacquerwork, and carpet weaving that influenced Ottoman, Mughal, and European styles, and the architectural vocabulary of Iwans, Muqarnas vaults, and tile mosaics that shaped Persia's urban landscapes for centuries. Their promotion of Persian language and culture within an Islamic framework laid the foundations for modern Iranian identity, while the political doctrine of the divine king and the close alliance between clergy and crown continued to resonate in successive dynasties and in the constitutional and theocratic movements of the 20th and 21st centuries. As we reflect on the Safavid era's transformations, from the zealous conquests of Shah Ismail to the cosmopolitan grandeur of Shah Abbas's Isfahan, and the tragic fall of Sultan Husaini. See an empire whose ambitious synthesis of religion, art, military innovation, and administrative centralization defined a golden age of Iranian civilization, and whose legacies continue to shape the cultural and political contours of the Middle East today. Emerging in the late 18th century from the ashes of the Safavid and Aftarid dynasties, the Qajar family under Aga Muhammad Khan seized control of Persia in 1789, establishing a new royal house whose authority rested on a delicate balance between tribal loyalties, clerical endorsements, and military power, ruling from the newly chosen capital of Tehran. Aga Muhammad Khan and his successors, most notably Fathali Shah and Nazar al-Din Shah, sought to consolidate central authority over fractious regional chieftains by granting tax farms to Qajar, princes and high-ranking military officers, by negotiating treaties with the expanding Russian Empire in the Caucasus, the treaties of Gulistan in 1813 and Turkmenchia in 1828 that ceded vast territories, and by attempting military modernization with the establishment of the Cossack Brigade under Russian officers such as Ivan Paskovitch. Yet these efforts were undermined by rampant court corruption, the hereditary allocation of revenues to princely appanages, and the reluctance of traditional landed elites to embrace sweeping reforms, leaving Persia increasingly indebted to European creditors and vulnerable to foreign intrusion. Under Nazar al-Din's long reign, Iranian intellectuals and traders exposed to constitutional ideas through contact with Russian reformers in the north and British merchants in the south began agitating for limits on royal prerogative, the establishment of a representative assembly, and the codification of laws, the tobacco protest of 1891 to 1892, in which a royal concession granted foreign companies a monopoly over Persia's tobacco crop, galvanized merchants, clerics led by Sheikh Jamal al-Din Vayyaz, Tabrizi, and urban notables into united resistance, forcing the Shah to cancel the concession and demonstrating the potency of popular mobilization. Inspired by this victory, Persia's first constitutional movement in 1905–1906 compelled Mozaffar al-Din Shah to promulgate the fundamental law and create the Majgels, embedding the principles of separation of powers, rule of law, and limited monarchy into Iran's governance framework. Although the experiment was repeatedly jeopardized by royal vetoes, foreign interventions during World War I, and the fragility of nascent political parties, the ideals of constitutionalism took permanent root in Iranian political culture in the aftermath of the war. Reza Khan, commander of the Cossack Brigade, seized power in a 1921 coup, eventually crowning himself Reza Shah Pahlavi in 1925, and embarked on an ambitious nation-building program that sought to extricate Iran from feudal structures and foreign dependency by centralizing administrative authority, secularizing education through the establishment of the University of Tehran in 1934, modernizing infrastructure with the Trans-Iranian Railway linking the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, and enforcing Western-style dress codes through the 1936 Kashf al-Hijab decree. Simultaneously, Reza Shah curtailed the power of the clergy by disbanding religious courts and absorbing Waqf revenues into the state treasury, while expanding military capabilities with German assistance, thereby laying the institutional foundations of a modern nation-state, but also provoking resentment among traditional notables and clerical circles, forced to abdicate by Allied occupiers in 1941. He was succeeded by his son Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, who navigated the tumultuous post-war era by balancing nationalist currents symbolized by Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh's successful 1951 nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company with Cold War geopolitics, the 1953 CIA and MI6-backed coup that overthrew Mossadegh and restored the Shah's absolute authority marked a turning point, enabling Mohammad Reza to consolidate power, suppress leftist and Islamist opposition, and pursue his White Revolution, beginning in 1963, which instituted land reform, expanded women's suffrage, and promoted literacy through the literacy cause, even as it accelerated urbanization, disrupted rural traditional structures, and deepened economic inequality. In the 1970s, growing discontent over authoritarian rule, rapid social change, and perceived Western cultural encroachment coalesced into a broad coalition led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, whose message of religious governance, social justice, and national independence resonated across the urban middle class, bazaar merchants, and rural poor. Mass demonstrations in 1978 and the Shah's loss of military and clerical support precipitated the monarchy's collapse in February 1979, ushering in the Islamic Republic. The new regime codified a theocratic constitution in December 1979 that vested supreme authority in the supreme leader initially Khomeini, who oversaw the Revolutionary Guard, a paramilitary institution tasked with safeguarding revolutionary ideals, while the newly elected president, parliament, and assembly of experts operated under clerical supervision. The release of hundreds of thousands of political prisoners, the purging of secular parties, and the reorientation of foreign policy toward anti-imperialism and support for Islamist movements marked a radical break with the Pahlavi era, almost immediately challenged by Iraq's invasion in September 1980. The Islamic Republic mobilized the population into Basij volunteer militias and Revolutionary Guard units, sustaining an 8-year war that claimed over 1 million lives, devastated border regions, and imposed heavy economic burdens through the requisition of oil export revenues to finance the military effort and reconstruction. The war's end in 1988, followed by Khomeini's death, ushered in a period of reconstruction under President Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who sought to rebuild infrastructure and liberalize the economy, but whose pragmatism faced resistance from hardline clerics and reformist intellectuals. The 1990s and early 2000s witnessed the emergence of the reformist movement under President Mohammad Khatami, 1997 to 2005, whose platform of the dialogue among civilizations, expanded press freedoms, and promotion of the rule of law won him to landslide electoral victories, yet encountered obstruction by the unelected Guardian Council, which vetted candidates and nullified key legislative initiatives, leading to disillusionment among young Iranians. Meanwhile, Iran's nuclear program, launched under the Shah with American assistance and continued under the Islamic Republic with Russian and Chinese support, attracted escalating sanctions after 2002, when Western intelligence agencies and the International Atomic Energy Agency uncovered uranium enrichment activities. The ensuing standoff shaped Iran's regional posture as it sought to leverage its nuclear dossier for relief from economic pressure, while maintaining a deterrent posture amid continued tensions with Israel and conservative Gulf states. In 2009, the disputed re-election of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad triggered the Green Movement, a nationwide protest campaign demanding electoral integrity and political freedoms, whose leaders Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi were placed under house arrest. Dissent was suppressed by the security apparatus, and digital activism through social media was met with internet blackouts. Yet the protests marked a watershed in popular engagement and galvanized a new generation of civil society actors. Over the following decade, despite intermittent economic relief, under the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action (JCPOA) and the presidency of Hassan Rouhani, Iran faced renewed US sanctions after the 2018 US withdrawal from the deal, leading to currency devaluation, inflation, and widespread dissatisfaction with official corruption and mismanagement. In late 2017 and early 2018, mass demonstrations over economic grievances broke out in dozens of cities, reflecting popular frustration at rising unemployment and spiraling prices. These protests evolved in November 2019 into a broader challenge to the regime following fuel price hikes. Now questioning the legitimacy of the clerical leadership band, again were met with lethal force, internet shutdowns, and arrests of thousands. Most recently, the death in custody of Mahsa Amini in September 2022 sparked a wave of nationwide protests across ethnic and class lines, unified by calls for women's rights, an end to mandatory hijab laws, and systemic political reform. Slogans such as "Woman, Life, Freedom" reverberated internationally, while security crackdowns, including mass executions and detentions, underscored the regime's determination to suppress dissent, even as protesters introduced decentralized organizing methods to withstand surveillance. Throughout this period, Iran's strategic posture has combined regional alliances with the Syrian government, Lebanese Hezbollah, and Iraqi Shia militias, with shadow warfare tactics, economic resilience driven by domestic oil revenue diversification, and barter trade arrangements, and soft power initiatives, such as cultural exports in cinema and literature. Concurrently, generational shifts, reflected in a median age below 35, high rates of university enrollment, especially among women, and pervasive use of digital communication pose enduring questions about the Islamic Republic's adaptability to popular demands for individual freedoms and global integration, as Iran navigates a complex interplay of internal reform pressures, regional rivalries, and global sanctions. The legacies of the Qajar constitutional experiment, Pahlavi modernization, revolutionary theocracy, wartime solidarity, and successive cycles of protest and repression continue to shape an evolving national narrative, one in which each new movement for justice, each assertion of political voice, and each negotiation with external powers contributes to the ongoing redefinition of what it means to be Iranian in the 21st century. When Ughur Muhammad Khan Qajar stormed into a lightly defended Tehran in 1789, he laid the groundwork for a dynasty that would preside often precariously over Persia's transition from a patchwork of tribal territories into a modern nation-state. His immediate successors, Pahlavi Shah and then Nasir al-Din Shah, faced formidable internal and external pressures as they endeavored to centralize authority, grant appanages iltizam to Qajar princes and military officers, and navigate the rapids of great power politics that saw Russia annex Georgia and other Caucasian lands under the treaties of Gulistan 1813 and Turkmenchay 1828, while Britain extended its influence in southern Persia to protect sea lanes to India and assert commercial privileges. The Qajar court at Tehran was riven by nepotism and revenue farming that enriched a landed elite but drained the treasury, prompting foreign loans that indebted the state and ignited popular resentment. This resentment crystallized in the tobacco protest of 1891 to 1892, when Bazari merchants and ulama under Sheikh Jamal al-Din Fayez Tabrizi united to force the cancellation of a British concession over the entire tobacco crop, demonstrating the latent power of coalitions between clerical leaders and urban merchants. Emboldened by this success, intellectuals and reformist clerics pressed for constitutional government, resulting in the Constitutional Revolution of 1905 to 1906, whereby Mozaffar al-Din Shah granted a constitution and established the Majlis Parliament, embedding principles of separation of powers, rule of law, and limited monarchy into Iran's political lexicon, even as subsequent Shahs sought to undermine or bypass the assembly through royal decrees, foreign intervention, and the manipulation of factional rivalries among emerging political parties, a turbulent prelude to the upheavals of the First World War, during which Persia's declared neutrality was violated by Russian, Ottoman, and British incursions that further discredited Qajar authority. In the aftermath of that global conflict, the Cossack Brigade's commander, Reza Khan, orchestrated a coup in 1921 that ultimately led to the abolition of the Qajar dynasty and the coronation of Reza Shah Pahlavi in 1925. As Shah, he embarked on an ambitious program of nation-building that included secularizing the school system, founding the University of Tehran in 1934, building the Trans-Iranian Railway linking the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, imposing Western dress codes under the Kashf-el-Hijab Decree of 1936, and centralizing tax collection, all while curbing the power of the clergy by dissolving religious courts and repurposing Waqf endowment revenues to fund state projects. Reza Shah's iron-fisted modernization drive accelerated urbanization and industrialization but alienated tribal confederations and clerical networks. During World War II, Allied fears of German influence prompted the Anglo-Soviet occupation and Reza Shah's forced abdication in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who inherited the twin burdens of maintaining territorial integrity and modernizing. Under the watchful eyes of both Moscow and London, the young Shah initially appointed the nationalist Mohammad Mossadegh as Prime Minister in 1951, whose bold nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company galvanized popular support but triggered an economic blockade by Britain. In 1953, a CIA and MI6 orchestrated cooperation, Ajax overthrew Mossadegh, restored the Shah's powers, and ushered in an era of increasingly autocratic rule, marked by the strengthening of Savak, the secret police, and lavish, Western-modeled court culture. In the ensuing years, the Shah launched the White Revolution in 1963. Land reform that redistributed small plots to peasant families, the extension of suffrage to women, and literacy campaigns that sought to dismantle feudal landholdings and co-opt the clergy. But these rapid social changes fueled rural displacement, swelled the ranks of the urban poor, and stoked discontent among bazaar merchants and clerical conservatives who saw traditional hierarchies overturned. By the late 1970s, mounting inflation, rampant inequality, and political repression ignited widespread protests, culminating in the 1978-1979 uprising led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, whose calls for Islamic governance and national sovereignty resonated across class lines. The Shah's flight in January 1979 paved the way for the establishment of the Islamic Republic, codified in a December 1979 referendum that vested supreme authority in the office of the supreme leader and created parallel institutions of clerical oversight such as the Guardian Council, which vets legislation and electoral candidates, alongside elected bodies including the President and Maj. Revolutionary tribunals purged officials associated with the Pahlavi regime. Women lost legal rights under new family laws, while revolutionary committees, later consolidated into the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps (IRGC), enforced ideological conformity. Shortly thereafter, the new regime confronted existential peril when Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded in September 1980. triggering an 8-year war that mobilized the Basij militia volunteer forces. Drawn from student corps and rural recruits, exacted a staggering human toll estimated at over 1 million combined casualties, devastated border cities like Khorramshahr and Abadan, and drained oil revenues as the state redirected resources toward military production and reconstruction. The 1988 ceasefire, brokered by the UN, enabled President Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani to pursue post-war reconstruction and limited economic liberalization, but internal power struggles between pragmatist and ideological factions, clerics like Ayatollah Montazeri versus hardliners in the IRG, C-shaped policy debates. The 1997 election of reformist President Mohammad Khatami Tommy, on a platform of dialogue among civilizations, transformed civil society through press freedoms, the proliferation of NGOs, and détente with the West. Yet, his ambitions were curtailed by the unelected Guardian Council and conservative judiciary, entrenching a pattern of limited openings followed by hardline retrenchment. Meanwhile, Tehran's pursuit of a uranium enrichment program initially launched under the Shah with American support became a flashpoint in the early 2000s, prompting UN sanctions in 2006 and isolating Iran economically, even as it developed indigenous nuclear and missile capabilities. The disputed 2009 re-election of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad sparked the Green Movement, a nationwide protest demanding electoral transparency and civil liberties. Security forces responded with mass arrests, violence, and a nationwide internet slowdown, demonstrating both the depth of popular activism and the regime's ability to suppress dissent. The election of Hassan Rouhani in 2013 raised hopes of sanctions relief through the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action (JCPOA). Yet the 2018 US withdrawal under President Trump and reimposition of maximum pressure sanctions precipitated a currency crisis, inflation, and renewed public anger over corruption and mismanagement. Protest waves in late 2017 and early 2018 erupted over austerity measures and lack of job opportunities. And again in November 2019, when a sudden hike in fuel prices expanded into mass demands for systemic change. The regime's lethal crackdowns, internet blackouts, and arrests of thousands highlighted both the potency of decentralized mobilization and the state's coercive capacities. In September 2022, the death in custody of Mahsa Amini ignited the woman, life, freedom movement, uniting urban youth, women, and ethnic minorities in calls for gender equality and the abolition of the mandatory hijab, even as security forces responded with brutal violence and mass executions in an effort to deter further dissent. Throughout these tumultuous decades, Iran has pursued a multifaceted foreign policies, supporting allied non-state actors from Hezbollah to the Houthis, deepening ties with China and Russia to offset Western sanctions, and projecting asymmetric deterrence through its missile arsenal and proxy networks while grappling with internal debates over economic diversification. Environmental crises such as water scarcity, and the tension between clerical rule and popular aspirations for greater political freedom. Iran's demographic profile: over 60% under the age of 35. High levels of female university enrollment and widespread digital connectivity portents future shifts in societal expectations, as new generations demand greater social liberties, even as they navigate an economy constrained by sanctions and global volatility. From the tribal confederacies of the Qajars to the modern struggles for constitutionalism, democracy, and social justice, Iran's story is one of continual adaptation, a nation forged by cycles of reform and repression, foreign intervention, and resistance, ideological revolution, and generational renewal, and as the woman, life, freedom movement demonstrates the quest to reconcile tradition and modernity. Faith and citizenship continues to define the evolving identity of the Iranian people. Thank you for joining us on this sweeping journey through modern Iran's triumphs and trials. If this deep dive resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment sharing your insights before we conclude our exploration of Persia's remarkable history.